It started with the stars blinking out, one by one. First, we thought it was a sensor glitch, a flicker in the observatory network. But then came the waveforms, impossibly stable, devastating in pattern. An antimatter wavefront, so dense it bent real space with its mass alone, was sweeping across Sector 12, incinerating solar systems like they were sparks from a campfire. The projections were absolute. We had 72 hours before it reached populated systems. I was among the first briefed on the anomaly. The moment I saw the simulations, I knew what I was looking at. Finality. Not destruction as we'd understood it before. This was the death of physics itself. Our scientists screamed. Our leaders fled the council floor mid-session. There was no time for planning, no time for contingencies. Just panic. My species was known for its logic, our devotion to rationalism. But in that chamber, among the most brilliant minds of our generation, we wept like children under a thunderstorm. I watched dignitaries from 39 different star nations claw at each other to access the emergency evacuation protocols, knowing full well that the wavefront would make such efforts pointless. What made it worse was the silence of the others. The ones who didn't show up. The ones who didn't bother answering the distress calls. The Terrans were among them. Of course they were. Last recorded transmission from their fleet was a static burst 2 months ago, shortly after they'd declared a new military blackout over their sol system. Most assumed they'd finally turned inward and given up on us. There were rumors, of course, that their core had grown too unpredictable, too dangerous to monitor. Our meeting continued without them. And what a meeting it was! The Kyrene High Priest suggested opening the sun and launching our genetic memory into its core. The Drakh Alliance proposed deploying every superweapon ever conceived in a final orgy of destructive hope. The Drenari collapsed into prayer circles, chanting as though the wavefront could be bribed with desperation. I remember my own voice, thin and useless as I offered telemetry data and probability curves no one could absorb. Even I couldn't. Every solution was met with blank stares, twitching limbs, or more shouting. If intellect was the crown of galactic civilization, then fear had just stolen it. They arrived 2 hours into the collapse of order. No ceremony. No preamble. Just a small delegation. 3 humans in black polymer uniforms and body armor so scratched it looked museum-aged. The tall one carried a case. The shortest wore a scarf inside out and chewed on something red. The third didn't speak, just watched. We did not acknowledge them at first. Why would we? Humanity had been absent from the Council for nearly 5 cycles. The last time they had participated in anything formal was during the Tevran Plague, when they dropped vaccine modules from orbit and left without comment. Arrogant, insufferable, unpredictable. When they finally walked to the podium, I fully expected some meaningless platitude. Instead, the tall one, male, aging, scarred, asked a single question. What's the wavefront's shape? One of our physicists, despite her trembling hands, activated the simulation. It played on the central holo display. When it ended, there was silence. Then the human groaned. Not a groan of despair or shock. Just annoyance. Fatigue. Like someone asked to fix the same engine for the 5th time that day. He looked at his companions. Sector 12 variant, 3rd gen expansion pattern. Looks familiar, doesn't it? The one with the scarf nodded. Yup. Same as Vega incident. Less noise, though. I stared at them. You've seen this before? The tall one shrugged. Seen worse. This one's cleaner. Cleaner? What was that supposed to mean? The room erupted again, this time not in panic but outrage. The council members berated them, accused them of mockery, of disrespect. One of the Drenari spit something venomous. The humans didn't even flinch. Do you have a plan? I demanded. The scarfed one laughed. Sure. But you're not going to like it. That was the end of their address. They left without elaborating, vanishing into the lower decks of the station. The council voted unanimously to ignore them. I abstained. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the human's voice. That groan. That tone. As if this wasn't some horrifying new threat, but a repeated inconvenience. Something they'd catalogued, studied, and probably filed under moderate hazard. So I followed them. They weren't hiding, not really. Just working. Their section of the station had been cordoned off, converted into what looked like a mobile construction site. Thick cables, radiation shields, banks of computers running indecipherable code. And humans. Not just 3. There were dozens. Men and women of varying ages, dressed in mixed gear. Some wore standard fleet attire, others sported exosuits patched with non-standard upgrades. No uniformity. No order. Yet everything moved with brutal efficiency. I stood outside their gate until one of them finally acknowledged me. A woman with streaks of grease on her neck and a data pad under her arm. She looked up and sighed. Observer. I nodded. You're late. Get in. No further questions. She simply turned and walked deeper into the chaos. I followed. They were building something. Or rather, several somethings. Modular platforms, acceleration arrays, graviton shears, things I had no name for. The woman noticed my confusion. You're trying to catalog this, aren't you? Yes. Don't bother. We don't follow the manuals. Too slow. She handed me a mug of something thick and bitter. We don't panic, she said. Because we already did that. Centuries ago. When the sky first fell. When Earth burned. When the colonies turned on us. We've had our fill of existential terror. You're implying you've faced this exact scenario? I asked. No. But close enough. Threats blend together after a while. The trick is realizing the universe doesn't care if you're scared. It just keeps going. So should we. That night, I reviewed every Terran log I could access. Most had been redacted. The rest were fragmented field reports and incident files so insane they had to be real. One described an experiment that opened a rift to a timeline where stars aged backward. Another recounted an evacuation from a planet eaten by its own artificial moon. They weren't exaggerating. I returned the next day. This time I asked questions. I watched how they calibrated instruments without speaking, how they ran simulations while cracking jokes about Terran sitcoms, how even their youngest engineers had a quiet gravity behind their eyes. No ceremony. No awe. Just competence built on a mountain of buried fear. I confronted the man from the council. The groaner. You weren't shocked, I said. Why? He leaned back in his chair and looked at me like I was missing the obvious. Because it's always something. One year it's an entropy spike. The next, a god-tier AI. This is clean. Predictable. Give us enough power and we can redirect it. Redirect? You're talking about an antimatter front folding into subspace. That's not something you redirect. He raised an eyebrow. Not for most species. I didn't know whether to be terrified or impressed. Probably both. That evening, they began loading Phase 1. I wasn't supposed to be there, but the grease-streaked woman waved me in. They were assembling something that resembled a railgun fused with a black hole stabilizer. The second pulse cannon was online within 40 hours. I had seen construction projects take decades for simpler machines. The humans did it in less than 2 cycles of the station's artificial day. And they weren't finished. They had already begun laying out the scaffolding for the graviton siphon, an experimental structure that, in theory, could drain potential energy directly from a collapsing star. In practice, no one had ever made one work without blowing up a system. The humans didn't seem worried. I kept asking questions. They kept giving answers like they were facts everyone should already know. One of the techs looked at me funny when I asked what the siphon's failsafe was. He replied, "Fail less." Then he walked off without further clarification. They weren't trying to sound clever. They genuinely lived by it. When I brought up the council's concerns about collateral damage, they barely reacted. They weren't arrogant. Just uninterested in bureaucracy. As far as they were concerned, survival came first. Everything else was paperwork. Even the graviton siphon was just another tool, useful, dangerous, necessary. What struck me was the attitude. I asked if they feared failure. One woman, too young to have seen the first hive war, didn't hesitate. "Every day," she said. "But we're not new to dying. We just figured out how to be bored with it." She was calibrating a sensor while saying this, half distracted, more focused on the next data pull than the existential dread most of the galaxy was drowning in. While other species held vigils, the humans ran diagnostic. While scientists debated escape arcs, they launched power relays. They didn't waste time hoping for rescue. They became the rescue. Not because they believed they would win, but because someone had to act like it was still possible. On the 71st hour, the wavefront changed. It accelerated. The telemetry came in with a spike so sharp it blew through 2 layers of shielding. The Council lost all composure. Broadcasts across 1,000 systems screamed at once. The evacuation attempts tripled. Every freighter, warship, and escape pod launched with or without permission. The result was chaos. Collisions, jamming, even friendly fire as panic spiraled into violence. And through it all, the humans didn't flinch. They adjusted. Within minutes of the acceleration, a new plan was in motion. The siphon deployment was pushed ahead by 6 hours. I asked the coordinator how they planned to activate it without full cooling cycles. She glanced at a chart, shrugged, and said, "We'll ride the melt." Not metaphorical. They fully expected components to liquefy mid-function. But they designed the activation sequence to account for that, as if entropy was just another feature. I began recording everything. Not just for science but for posterity. For history. Because I was watching something no historian had ever documented. Humanity refusing to give up in real time, even when the math said they should. We lost contact with the outer defense arrays by hour 72. The council chambers went offline shortly after. I don't know if they were destroyed or simply abandoned. The humans didn't wait to find out. They launched the siphon's core with a booster rig designed for comet capture. It wasn't elegant. It shook the entire station and shattered half the viewing deck. But it worked. When the siphon ignited, I saw gravity ripple. Actual visible distortion. That shouldn't be possible. And yet, there it was. Space itself bending in slow oscillations as the machine drank from the nearby neutron well. The surrounding temperature dropped 30 degrees in under a minute. I couldn't feel my fingers. The air cracked. But the humans kept working. One tech lost a hand to frostbite. He didn't even scream. Just clamped the wound, injected a stimpack, and kept running calculations with his other arm. They weren't brave in the way stories describe. They were past bravery. It was reflex now. Routine. I found the old one again, the tall one from the council podium. He was watching the readings on a cracked tablet, sipping something from a metal flask. I asked him if this was normal. If they always did this. "No," he said. "Sometimes it's worse." I told him the council was gone. "I know. You don't care." "I didn't say that. But they weren't helping." He tapped the screen. This helps." I asked him how many humans had faced things like this before. He didn't answer directly. Just muttered something about a list too long to finish. Then he said, "We don't live in fear. We live after it." The siphon reached threshold output in 11 minutes. That was a surprise. They'd budgeted 30. The technician closest to the core nearly broke his face grinning. They fed the energy directly into the main array, rerouted all non-essential power, and fired both gravitic cannons in sequence. The wavefront buckled. Not stopped. Not destroyed. But redirected. A microfluctuation appeared along its leading edge. The kind of fracture that, with enough pressure, could cascade. It was the first real sign that the humans might actually win. But the cost came fast. The power systems started failing. Not crashing, detonating. The energy draw had overloaded 3 layers of containment. One station wing vented into space. I saw people fly out the breach. No screams. Just movement. The humans barely paused. One shouted, "Seal breach. Log casualties later." Another was already welding shut a second door with a portable torch. I tried to help. They didn't stop me. I wasn't one of them, but I wasn't in the way either. They let me pull cables, monitor pressure, reroute coolant. I didn't understand half of what I was doing. They didn't care. They needed hands. I gave mine. The third cannon was almost ready. It was a prototype even they hadn't tested. When I asked what it did, one human laughed. "Depends which way the barrels pointed." They weren't joking. It was called the Lance. It functioned by compressing directional time flow and discharging it into a particle stream. A weaponized paradox, aimed at the point of most tension in the wavefront. If it hit, the timeline in that vector would attempt to reverse, briefly and violently. Enough to destabilize the structure. I told them that was madness. They agreed. But they aimed it anyway. The energy required for a single shot was staggering. They drained every reserve, then tapped into the siphon directly. The resulting pressure forced the station into lockdown. I was pushed against a bulkhead, watching as the team shouted coordinates, adjusted angles, corrected for orbital drift, and ran emergency damping cycles. Then they fired. No light. No sound. Just absence. Like someone ripped a hole in reality. And for a second, just one, the wavefront stopped. Everything in the system went still. Then it screamed. Not literally. But every sensor across every platform registered the same thing. Vibration in vacuum. The wavefront had fractured. Not along a line, but along a volume. Its structure was breaking apart internally. Not enough to vanish. But enough to veer. Enough to miss us. I was there when the new trajectory was confirmed. The calculations took hours, but the end result was clear. The wavefront would pass by 0.07 parsecs wide. Close enough to fry satellites, but far enough to leave planets intact. The aftershocks weren't over. The redirected wavefront spared the core systems, but its gravitational bleed had sheared 2 outer colonies clean off their orbital planes. 6 other relay stations went silent. An unknown number of ships were either vaporized or scattered in FTL misjump. The Galactic Council, or what was left of it, called for recovery operations. But the humans were already gone. No memorials. No statements. They never stayed for applause. The few of us who had worked alongside them during those 72 hours tried to explain what we had seen. No one believed the full story. The recordings helped, but even then, there were accusations of deepfakes and artificial narrative. People wanted to believe it had been a trick of physics or luck. Something explainable. Something not human. It was easier to dismiss it than to accept that humanity had once again done the impossible and refused to gloat. I was assigned to investigate a dead zone near the edge of the red light fringe, an area where comms had dropped just before the wavefront shift. We arrived to find debris fields twisted in impossible angles, time dilation pockets warping light itself, and a single human vessel, half destroyed, holding orbit with one functioning thruster. No life signs. No black box. But inside the shattered hull was a scrawled message in blood across a wall panel. We held. They had held a flank we hadn't even known existed. And died doing it. Back at Central, the scientific community dissected the Lance weapons data. They couldn't replicate it. The formulas didn't work when transferred into conventional systems. The power thresholds didn't match expected outputs. One scientist published a paper calling it theoretical hallucination turned engineering stunt. Another called it impossible courage made manifest. None of them understood the human tendency to look at a paradox and build anyway. Rumors surfaced of hidden bases, human black sites, fleets that didn't answer to Earth's main command. Some thought the crew we saw had gone rogue. Others believed they were a myth engineered by the Terran government to scare galactic powers into submission. But I had seen the burn marks on their hands. I had smelled the coolant in the air. They were no myth. Just professionals who never asked for permission. With the Council fractured and the wave front still decaying, dozens of systems turned to private militaries and warlords for protection. But some called for Earth. Quietly, cautiously. No official declarations, just encoded requests routed through old diplomatic channels. The humans answered none of them. Not directly. But 3 months later, a collapsed mining station in the Creel sector received a crate with atmospheric processors and a handwritten note. Keep the kids inside. It gets cold fast. No signature. No insignia. Just fingerprints baked into the weld. Human fingerprints. The Federation of Alvenar opened an embassy to Earth for the first time in 400 years. The humans sent a janitor and a coffee machine. The ambassador laughed, called it a joke. Until the janitor fixed their crumbling fusion grid in under an hour and left behind a full diagnostic blueprint. The machine brewed the best coffee in the sector. I followed the data trails. Every anomaly, every signal spike, every system that reported sudden unexplainable improvements after human contact. And always the same pattern. No announcements, no press, just result. Silent corrections to a broken galaxy. One day, I received an unmarked packet. Inside was footage of the Siphon's internal logs. Unredacted. The last message from the lead engineer read, "If this works, no one will thank us. If it fails, they'll blame us. Do it anyway." And they had. Even as survivors rebuilt, tensions rose again. Old enemies resurfaced. Power vacuums created opportunity, and war never stays buried for long. Yet every time violence threatened to reignite, something unexpected would stop it. A missile would detonate prematurely. A reactor would shut down before overloading. A dictator's warship would vanish en route to conquest. None of it was traceable, but every piece smelled like human hands. I was stationed on Karthus Station when the emissary from Zather Prime tried to reignite anti-Terran sentiment. He claimed humans were manipulating galactic fate, interfering with natural political evolution, acting as unappointed guardians of chaos. He wasn't wrong. But no one listened. Because when the lights went out on half the station due to a solar flare, it wasn't his people who fixed it. It was a human maintenance drone with no record of registration. It repaired the shielding, rebooted the systems, and vanished before security arrived. The emissary left the next day. I kept finding more threads. A failed colony on the rim rebuilt itself in record time using outdated schematics that no one had the courage to try, except for a human volunteer team that showed up, rewired the reactors, and disappeared before the first harvest. Their last transmission simply read, "Good luck. You'll do fine." It wasn't just technology. It was mindset. They taught people to improvise, to embrace failure as a step forward, to build anyway. They didn't just fix systems, they infected them with resilience, a contagion of grit. Eventually, I was called to testify before the Reformed Council. They wanted answers about what Earth had done, how they survived, why they interfered, whether they posed a threat. I told them everything, and none of them believed me, except one. She was a new appointee from a system Earth had saved during a volcanic chain collapse, something most thought unpreventable. She'd been a child then. Now she wore the seal of her planet's highest office. She asked only one question. If the humans are so dangerous, why are we still alive? No one answered. The council adjourned without resolution. Later, she found me. She asked what humanity really wanted. I told her I didn't know. But I had a theory. They didn't want power. They didn't want credit. They wanted to be left alone until the galaxy set itself on fire. Then show up, put it out, and leave again without a thank you. Because somewhere in their history they had learned that heroes got statues, but survivors got to come home. I began writing down everything I remembered, everything I'd seen. I published it under a pseudonym. It was dismissed as fantasy, conspiracy fiction, fringe propaganda. But I didn't care. It wasn't for them. It was for the ones who would panic at the next final hour. So they would know. that somewhere, out in the void, humanity was still watching, still waiting, still ready to groan in exasperation, roll up their sleeves, and fix everything one more time. Not because they wanted to, but because no one else would. Because humans don't save the galaxy for praise. They do it because someone has to. And they always show up, late, unannounced, underestimated, but ready. And that's how we survive. We panic, they sigh, and then they save us, again.